before we kick off. So while we're waiting for people to hop on the call, I thought I'd just give a bit of an overview about who we are and what this session's about. So I'm Lauren, your host for today, and I work in the marketing team and help to set up sessions like this one. I'll be joined by my wonderful colleague, Stu Taylor, who'll be leading today's session. I've had a sneak peek of it and thought it was just brilliant, so I hope you guys enjoy it too. I'll introduce Stu in more detail shortly. But before I do that, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview into who CX Partners are for anyone that might not know. So CX Partners is the research and design team within Sopra Steria Next UK. Together, they form a consultancy that reimagines the organisations and the services that shape the UK today. They design and deliver innovative and effective end-to-end transformation programmes for some of the UK's most well-known brands. So it looks like we have most people with us now, so I'll get started and introduce today's session. Our webinar today is all about how to improve comprehension using design. So it's the second session in our two-part webinar series that was designed to help you meet your ongoing consumer duty obligations by making customer communications clearer. If you've not had a chance to watch the first one, I'll pop a link in the Slido with the recording so you can catch up afterwards, and I highly recommend giving it a watch. It was great. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, our head of design, Stu Taylor, is leading today's session. Stu has over 15 years of experience in UX and service design for a range of clients, including Google, Nike, and the Cooperative Bank. His work at CX Partners focuses on designing and leading programs to help organizations increase their customer centricity. So in this webinar, he'll be sharing tips on how to design for comprehension. He'll bring those tips and principles to life with lots of great examples, and then he'll be explaining why they work. So then you'll be able to apply these ideas and make things clearer for your customers. So I'll hand over to Stu in just a moment, but first I wanted to cover some brief housekeeping. So I wanted to let you know that this is a one-way webinar, which means no one can see you or hear you. You can, however, ask questions using Slido, so you'll find a button for that at the bottom right of your screen. And you can ask questions with your name or anonymously, and then I'll pop back at the end of the presentation so I can ask you all of your questions. And then finally, if you'd like to turn on closed captions, you can find that in the bottom left corner of the screen. So I think that's everything from me. So Stu, over to you.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Also, bonus points to anyone that came to the last webinar and still turned up today, so thank you. So in that first part that Laura mentioned, we talked about our approach for testing comprehension. And this is where we carry out user research using a mix of different methods. As Lauren says, that should be available online now. And if that first part was all about identifying issues with understanding, this is all about how do you actually go about improving comprehension. But why is that important? Well, firstly, the regulator wants you to do it. So I imagine a lot of you are here because of the consumer duty. And as you probably know, consumer understanding is one of the 4 outcomes that the FCA expects firms to deliver. But the reason that regulation exists is because of the millions of people using financial services every day. And in the FCA's latest Financial Lives survey, they report that 6.5 million people in the UK have low financial capability. And by that, they mean things like knowledge of financial matters or confidence in managing money. And there's 10.3 million people that reported low confidence in working with numbers in their everyday lives. And in our research, we see the impact of complicated or confusing financial information all the time. So last week, my colleague Stu shared this quote from some of our user research. So it's all banking talk, they're talking to each other. And the reason I'm interested in this comes back to a project I worked on almost a decade ago. We helped the Cooperative Bank redesign their public-facing website. And one of the key things that we did was try to make things like charges really clear and understandable so that there were no hidden surprises. And in the research that we were doing, people said things like, it's not just a bank, it's supporting people. But in terms of improving conversion rates, it felt a bit of a counterintuitive idea. However, credit card applications went up 90% and NPS went up almost 6 points. And since then, I've had this real interest in how do you help make complicated things easier for people to understand. And I have a real belief that we can do better. There's so many different sources now to help us. There's cognitive and behavioural science, there's education, instructional design, and lots more. And there's lots of great work already being done in this area. So today I'm going to share some of those theories, examples, and tips for how to improve comprehension. And it won't cover everything. Instead, I'm going to focus on some of the key things that we've learned through our research and design work. Hopefully there's going to be some new ideas in there, but some of it will be quite familiar to some of the audience. And the reason I've included those familiar things is that organizations can often forget the basics, or they might discount and deprioritize things that to them seem superfluous. Okay, so today I'm going to begin with what you should choose to communicate in the first place. Then I'll go through the basic building blocks for comprehension. So text, numbers, images, video. And then I'll go through putting those together, looking more at structure. So firstly, what should you communicate? In our last webinar, I explained how working memory is a bit like a bookshelf. So bits of information get piled on like books, and before you know it, those books start to fall off, leading to what we call cognitive overload. So there's just too many books, too much information, and too many ideas. So when thinking about what you should communicate, the key is fewer ideas. And just to be clear, this isn't about writing, concise writing or word counts, which are important, but this is about the number of ideas that you communicate. So Todd Rogers and Jessica Lasky-Fink are behavioural scientists, and they ran a study at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and they texted almost 23,000 parents with a request to complete a survey. And half of that group received this version. And it had a couple of sentences in there that kind of empathised with the situation the parents were in. So it said, "We know distance learning can be hard. We want to help and to hear from you." And so it adds warmth to the request, but it's an additional idea. The second version that they tested removed that idea, and the result ended up yielding 6% more responses. This is another study from Rogers and Lasky-Fink. They emailed almost 780,000 potential donors as part of a political campaign. I just conventional wisdom in fundraising is that longer messages are generally more effective. So this is the original email, 6 paragraphs, compelling facts as you go through it. But in the other version they tested, they arbitrarily deleted every other paragraph. So they're cutting the number of ideas in half. And they found that the email flowed less coherently in the study. But despite that, it still ended up raising 16% more money. We've applied this idea of fewer ideas in our work too. So we were testing a document that contained a table. There are lots of different columns with what felt like to the organization important information. But after some user testing, we then prioritized the key concepts to communicate, and we cut the number of columns down. We then took the information from the other columns and put them to a separate section at the end of the document. But it was amazing how suddenly people could make sense of what was before quite complex and confusing data. And this can be quite a hard thing for organizations to realize, that in order to improve comprehension, they basically have to tell people less. So how do you decide what concepts to prioritize? In my last webinar, I explained the 2 things that you should focus on. Firstly, what are the actions that people need to take on the back of your document? And then you need to prioritize the information that helps people to take that action. Secondly, what are the foundational concepts that people need to have in place to make sense of the rest of any information? So these are concepts like knowing what a fund is. It's the things that if people don't understand would remove whole branches of understanding. But to help you choose what concepts to communicate, the most important thing you can do is research with your audience. If you read any book on communication, it always starts with understanding who your audience is. And that's because it helps you understand their goals. So again, what actions do they need to do they want to do or need to take, and what information do they need to take those actions? It will help you understand what prior knowledge or foundational knowledge they have. For example, we've seen that mortgage buyers can be confused by quite basic concepts within the mortgage process, even when they've been through it before. Research will also help you understand whether any technical language you're using is common parlance for your audience or whether it's just jargon. And you can tailor your messaging. So understanding what matters to people can help you signpost why something would be important for them. Okay, so we're going to do a quick quiz now. So the quiz is a fill in the blank quiz. You won't be able to kind of interact with it in Slido. It's just a kind of quiz to run in your head, I guess. So communicating what ideas is proven to lead to greater engagement with content. Is it more, fewer, or 3 to 5? So the answer is fewer ideas. And doing research with your audience will help you to understand their goals, identify what knowledge they already have, tailor your messaging, or all of the above. So it's all the above. Okay, so hopefully that should help you decide what to communicate. Now let's look at the how and the main building blocks for communication. So first up is text. And there's lots of information out there about how to write more clearly and to use plain English. So I'm going to breeze through this quite quickly. But there is one point I want to emphasize. Well, it's 3 really, but short paragraphs, short sentences, short words. And there's lots of studies showing how each of these 3 things make it easier to read content. And if it's easier to read, the more likely people engage and the easier it will be to understand. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that it's really commonly ignored. In our work, we often see long paragraphs of text, and then we see people almost instinctively skip over those paragraphs. We also see long sentences with buried clauses, and people often get lost in the middle of those. So this is a really important point. And I came across this great quote. It's from a journalist, Alan Little. It's from a BBC training video. And he says, short words in short sentences present the listener or reader with the fewest barriers to comprehension. And I really love that idea of these barriers to comprehension. Hopefully that's a good reminder for people. So less is more, but not always. So one exception to less is more is what we call micro explanations. And if you're involved in digital design, you've probably come across the term microcopy, and that's copy on things like buttons or links. And this is essentially the same thing, but the intent is more focused on explanation rather than usability. This is an example from outside of financial services. It's an energy statement. And the bit I want you to focus on is that previous balance. So the statement says the previous balance here was £12.36 DR. If you don't know what that stands for, it's debit. But if you compare that to a bill from Octopus, so they say your balance was below 0, and then it gives the figure. So they're using this micro explanation, and it means they don't even have to use the word debit. Here's another example. This is from Monzo. It's a screen showing the details of a payment using their Flex card, which is their kind of buy now, pay later product. And essentially what the screen's showing you is the installments for paying back a purchase. And here there's a link to Pay Off Extra, which is where you pay off more than the agreed installments. And underneath there's this micro explanation that says payments are taken off the final installment. So it just clarifies how that works. There's also an option to add to what they call a running split, which it briefly explains is great for group holidays and house shares. So that's micro explanations. And as I said, I'm not going to dwell on text, so I'm moving on to numbers now. And this is obviously relevant as financial service firms deal with a lot of numbers. And numbers can be a real challenge for a lot of people. As I mentioned earlier, over 10 million adults report low confidence in working with numbers. So there's a great book called Making Numbers Count by Chip Heath and Carla Starr. In that, they introduced the idea of user-friendly numbers. And one way to make numbers more user-friendly is to round them. So rather than saying 87.387 kilometers, you could say slightly under 90 kilometers. So I hope you can see that that's easier to process. And obviously, in financial services, you typically need to be precise, and rounding won't work in a lot of cases. But do users really need to see percentages to 3 or 4 decimal places? Also, people generally struggle with numbers less than 1. So that includes things like fractions, decimals, and percentages. And Heath and Starr use a method called counting in baskets to help with this. I'll just show you how that works. So instead of saying 0.34165, you could say a little over 3 out of 10. And instead of the fraction 2 over 49, you could say about 1 out of 25. And instead of 64% of people, you could say 2 out of 3 people. So again, hopefully you can see how those are easier to process. Another way we found to make numbers more user-friendly is to use pounds and pence rather than percentages. So this is an example from GoHenry. So GoHenry's a kind of pocket money app for kids and their parents. And here it talks about the kid's saving account and the interest that the dad is paying on the kid's savings. So he's paying 15% interest. And it then converts that percentage into pounds. So saying 0.43 pounds, making it more understandable. And it looks as well like they've rounded that to the nearest pence as well. This is another example from Robinhood. So Robinhood is an online trading platform based in the States. And this is a snippet from a page about their fees. And it shows you what you'd pay in percentages, but also converts it to pounds. There are other cases when percentages are better, and that's typically when you want to make some kind of comparison. So when you're buying a credit card, knowing the APR is useful because it allows you to compare with different providers. And converting percentages to pounds is one example of a wider principle, which is don't make people do calculations. So it's extra cognitive load. It makes people do work that they shouldn't have to. This is an example from True Potential. So they're a wealth management firm. This is a page from their site about charges and fees again. But to avoid you calculating charges, you plug in how much you might want to invest, and then it works out how much you would pay in pounds and pence. Another way you can sometimes make numbers more understandable is by putting them within a sentence. And that's what True Potential were doing in that last example. Habito is a mortgage comparison service, and they do it with their mortgage calculator results. And Octopus do it in that statement that I showed earlier. So on 18th of May, your balance was £90. We've since charged you £84, and you've paid in £0. Now your balance is £175. And the reason it seems to work is because of the connectives that it uses. So things like was, since, and now. And it's recognized that connectives more generally can help comprehension. Final thing I wanted to cover with numbers was translating numbers. So in the book I mentioned earlier, Making Numbers Count, they give this example. So McDonald's alone outspends the 5-a-day campaign by 350 to 1. And they translate that to, if a child sees a McDonald's commercial every single day, it would take them almost a year to see just one commercial about 5 a day. So if you don't know, 5 a day is similar to the campaign that we had over here around encouraging people to eat more vegetables. But they've translated that ratio of 350 to 1 into time there, so a year and a day. And this is all about putting numbers into human terms that people can understand. This is a nice example from the Trainline app. So I booked a train and I saved 444 kilograms. But what does that really mean? And so they translate it into you not using your washing machine for 3 years. I took a similar approach for a speculative prototype I made a couple of years ago. The idea was to communicate the environmental impact of pensions. So this is a bit like a pension statement, but it's formatted more like a Spotify year in review type experience. But the key part was translating the pension's carbon emissions from something abstract, like 14.7 tonnes, into something concrete, like a pile of coal. And maybe there are better translations available, but to really bring the translation to life, the idea was to turn the pile of coal into an augmented reality experience, hopefully making the numbers a really kind of visceral experience, especially when you look at the size of the pile at retirement. If you want to learn more about numbers and user-friendly numbers, there's a great site called Accessible Numbers by Laura Parker, and I'm sure a lot of you will probably be familiar with plain numbers as well. Okay, next up, images. So images are one of those things that I mentioned at the start that organizations can discount as being superfluous. And so I want to change opinions on that. My point is that images are much more than decorative elements. They can have a really clear role in aiding comprehension. So we're going to do an experiment now. I want you to imagine that there's a university project called the Modern Europe Project. I'm going to read out this text and then you ask you a few questions. So Jenny is head of the humanities faculty. Fatima is the head of the history department. Tom, Joe and Sue work for Fatima. Harry is the head of the geography department. Joe, Chaz and Tanya report to Harry. Sue, Joe, Chaz and Harry are working together on the joint Modern Europe project. Okay, so now the questions. Who is the highest ranking person on the Modern Europe project? Which department has the most people on the Modern Europe project? And which people are not involved with the Modern Europe project? Any luck? I'm imagining maybe not. So I'm going to try a different approach. So this is a diagram of the different departments and people involved in the project. So let's try the questions again. Who is the highest ranking person on the Modern Europe project? Well, it's Harry. Which department has the most people on the Modern Europe project? So it's the geography department. And which people are not involved with the Modern Europe project? So it's Jenny, Fatima, Tom, Joe, and Tanya. So hopefully this demonstrates that visuals can massively help comprehension. I want to credit Oliver Caviglioli for this experiment. He's the author of a book about dual coding. So dual coding is a cognitive theory about why images help understanding, but also recall. And according to this theory, 2 information channels feed our working memory. If you remember, we described working memory as a bit like a bookshelf. So you have the visual channel, which is known as the visuospatial sketchpad, and that processes pictures. And then you have the verbal channel, known as the auditory loop, that processes words. And that's also activated when you read things as well. And according to this theory, when you receive information in two different ways, it unlocks more of your working memory because you have access to both the visual and the verbal memory capacity. So you almost have two bookshelves. And what's more, studies of dual coding have shown that information is retrieved and remembered more easily. So let's have a look at a few examples. This is another one from Monzo. It uses these bar charts to show what you spent each month, so money in, money out. But what's interesting is that there's this view to show spending for previous months, and at a glance you can see where you've overspent, which happens too much. But like the Modern Europe example, the images quickly reveal data that would be really long-winded to explain in words. This is another example from Robin Hood. It's a good example of using images to support the meaning of text. So it's really dual coding in action. And there's an image to represent shares and another for inflation. Another example from Monzo, this is from some time ago actually, but they used to use an image of a pot during the onboarding process for setting up savings pots. But it's a really good example of a visual metaphor. And there's lots of different ways that images convey information, but this is a really useful one when trying to explain something. This is another kind of visual metaphor. It's Robin Hood again. So they show a company split into a series of cubes as a metaphor for shares. And they carry on this metaphor through the onboarding process of their app. So if you're trying to explain something complex, have a think about whether there's a useful visual metaphor that you can use. Okay, so related to images, a video, and again, this is one that I feel is maybe undervalued by organizations, or if they do value it, it's maybe because it's got some, it's a bit like TikTok or Instagram. But like images, they make use of dual coding to help people manage working memory and improve recall. So the video I'm about to show is from Snoop. So if you don't know, Snoop's an app that uses open banking to give you tips on how to save money. A few years ago, we were working for a client looking at how competitors explain open banking. And this video was pretty much the best of the bunch. And I think it shows why videos are a good explanatory tool. So it spaces the information out. It uses movement to show cause and effect. And it also uses a kind of visual metaphor with these power cables and locks to explain how the process of open banking works. One of the other reasons that videos work well is that they use spoken rather than written language. There's a few reasons why spoken language is easier to understand than written language, but probably the biggest one is what's called prosodic information, and this is the intonation and the stress of spoken language. So a rising tone can indicate a question. A pause can indicate a change of subject or line of argument. And you can speak slower to really emphasize something important. But videos have a few drawbacks as well. If you get the pacing wrong, people might struggle to keep up and then they become overloaded. That's because they're not going at their own pace, like when they read. Videos can also be a passive experience. So you can watch them, but if you're not motivated to learn, the information can pass you by. And we'll come on to some solutions for that later. But just to make sure you're not having a too passive experience, here's the next quiz. So what paragraphs, sentences, and words help comprehension? Is it long, a mix of long and short, or short? So it's short. And which type of number is the most user-friendly? Is it percentages, whole numbers, fractions, or decimals? Answer is whole numbers. Dual coding helps people to understand and retain information by making use of repeated reading, people's inherent love of images, the visual and verbal information channels, and the answer is the visual and verbal information channels. So those two channels feed our working memory. And then the last one, intonation, pauses, and stress in what mean that videos can help understanding. Is it written language, images, spoken language? It's a spoken language there. Okay, so that was some guidance and background on the building blocks for explaining. Now let's look at how you can put them together. So really what I'm looking at here is how you structure your communications to help understanding. My first recommendation is to use the power of summaries. Again, this may seem like an obvious one, but time and again in our design and research, we see that when we add a summary, it can have a huge impact on comprehension. In the last webinar, I talked through some common issues that we see, and one of them was around information or key information being buried in the document. And I gave this example from a mortgage illustration, and those all-important monthly payments were treated at the same level as everything else. But if you compare that to Habito again, here the monthly payments are really clear in this summary of a mortgage option. And the in a nutshell example I showed earlier from Octopus is another great example. And what's so good about summaries is that they help you prevent cognitive overload. So people can choose to stop reading after the summary if they want, or they can dig into the detail if they prefer. This is that same true potential example again. It's a really nice clear summary, and you could stop reading there, or you could get into the detail. And the other great thing about summaries is that they help you make sense of the detail. So they provide a kind of framework for your understanding. And this is really useful for people with dyslexia, and that's because of something called comprehension monitoring. So let me explain what that is. So skilled readers constantly keep track of their comprehension. So they go along as they read, checking that they understand. But if something goes off track, the text doesn't make sense, they go back and reread a section, and they go along, go back if comprehension goes off track, and then they go along, go back, go along. However, if you're not good at comprehension monitoring, you can have a bit of a hard time. So when you go off track, you might not be aware of it, and then you carry on reading. And then at the end, a big chunk won't have made much sense. But this is where summaries can help. So a summary up front provides a high-level understanding, which the detail can then elaborate on. Okay, the next important strategy when it comes to structuring content is segmentation. So segmentation is a common approach in multimedia learning and e-learning, and you see it in services like Domestika, where videos are broken down into chapters. And studies have shown that high segmentation in multimedia learning significantly impacts cognitive load, and it improves comprehension as well as retention. This is another common interaction pattern that you see. You may see it in apps like Duolingo, or this is an app called Imprint. And this one's talking about how compound interest works. And the content is broken down into these bite-sized segments that the user can go through in their own pace. This is the same kind of pattern used in Robinhood and in Monzo. And these are really nice. There's lots of animations, and it's just a really lovely way of explaining the principles of investing. And you even start to see this on the BBC News, where they break down key stories into these segments. We were working on a concept not long ago for a platform for car finance remediation. And essentially that's where you get a refund if you've had car finance missold to you. And we knew that we needed to explain how these refunds were calculated so that people would trust the system. And so we used segmentation and images to explain the calculations. And when we tested this, we had really good results in terms of comprehension. So this approach uses some of the addresses some of the problems that I mentioned that video can introduce. So it allows people to pause, to process the information at their own pace, and reduce cognitive load. The other issue that I mentioned with video was that it was passive. But another good thing about segmentation is that it creates friction, and it's actually adding cognitive load. It's a certain type of cognitive load called germane cognitive load, which is like a good version. Essentially, it provides friction that helps you interact with the content. Okay, so that's segmentation. And the third strategy that I was going to talk through was around layering. And this is where you consider how to add more detail into your communication. One layering strategy that's quite common is footnotes. Problem with this approach that we consistently see in our research is that people don't really read footnotes. Sometimes that can be useful to you, and it can actually benefit the reader. So if you're forced to provide some information but it has little importance to the reader, the footnotes can help direct attention to the right place. But let me show you a not so good example. This is a snippet from the pension statement I showed in the last webinar. It's talking about costs and charges, but to find the information on costs and charges, you have to visit a URL. This isn't technically a footnote, but it's the same kind of approach where information is separated off to another location. But the thing I really dislike about this example is that the bolded URL at the bottom isn't about costs and charges, it's about their climate impact. The URL for costs and charges is actually buried in the middle there. But just to be fair on Scottish Widows, who the pension statement is from, this is another snippet from that same statement. And this is talking about the money that you could have at retirement. And the good thing is there's this detailed explanation about the calculation, and it's provided right below rather than directing people to a footnote. And I'm not saying that explanation is good, but it's easy to find. And we call this approach an inline explanation, and it's generally a better strategy than footnotes if you want people to read the detail. The other option you have in digital is what we call progressive disclosure. Again, you're probably familiar with this if you're working in digital design. Information is layered again, but the additional detail is only revealed when you interact with the interface in some way. So this example from Octopus, it says the account's in debit. You can then click on this link to go to a page about why an account may be in debit. As an aside, I think it's a bit of a shame that they use debit rather than sticking to the language of below zero here. But anyway, recently we've also been exploring another idea for inline explanations. And this idea emerged from this design pattern on one of Airbnb's marketing pages. And it's a little thumbnail link to a keynote speech. And I've called this idea video annotations, and there's maybe other already examples like this in the wild, and I'd love to see them if there are. But the idea is that instead of inline text explanations, you have these inline video explanations. That could be used to provide a summary. It's like here, you could watch a summary about what you've paid into your pension. Or it could provide an explanation of something more technical and potentially confusing, like tax relief or pension investment approach. And here, the videos are segmented, so each one is more of a snippet. But also because they're integrated within the layout of the page, they provide a bit of a visual anchor or bookmark that people can find easily, so they're not having to search and find the relevant bit within a longer video. And once you get into the video, you can make use of dual coding, spoken language, and all the other good stuff that we've talked about. I almost made it through 2 webinars without mentioning AI, but thanks to AI and tools like Synthesia, you can make these videos dynamic and include people's data. I think that's a really exciting kind of possibility for making communications clearer. Right, so that's the end of the third part and time for the final quiz. So summaries help people understand by directing attention to important information, reducing the impact of difficulties with comprehension monitoring, or both A and B. It's both A and B. Segmentation is where educational content is targeted at different market segments, split up to reduce cognitive load, or sweet and juicy like an orange. I find it quite hard to kind of come up with quiz answers at this point. But the answer is split up to reduce cognitive load, so that's segmentation. And inline explanations are more or less likely to be read than footnotes. And it's more. Okay, so in the spirit of summarization, here's a recap of everything we've covered today. So first we looked at what you should communicate. The key is fewer ideas. I realise this is quite ironic because I've gone through way too many ideas in today's session, but I promise I did cut out quite a lot as well. But to prioritise ideas, you need to do research with your audience. You should then prioritise concepts based on what information people need to take action, and then look at the foundational concepts they need to understand. Then we looked at the building blocks. First was text. So use short paragraphs, short sentences, short words to remove those barriers to comprehension, but also look at how you can use micro explanations. Next was numbers. Use user-friendly numbers where you round them and avoid fractions. Use pounds and pence rather than percentages. That's part of a wider principle around not making people do calculations. And then also putting numbers in sentences can help people make sense of them. And translating numbers can help make them more human, a bit like that big pile of coal. Next was images. My main point was that they're more than decoration. They're invaluable at helping comprehension. That's because of dual coding theory, which helps increase working memory. And images can communicate information in lots of different ways, but one key way is through visual metaphors. I also made the point that videos can be undervalued. They use dual coding as well, and they make use of intonation and stress in spoken language. But videos can lead to cognitive overload if the pacing's wrong, and they can be too passive. Finally, we looked at structure. I emphasised how important summaries were, especially for comprehension monitoring. We looked at segmentation to help readers take things at their own pace. We looked at layering techniques, so beware of footnotes, try inline explanations and progressive disclosure instead. And a common idea through those was to increase friction. Okay, but there's a bit of a twist with all of this. There's one crucially important method that you need to improve comprehension. So all of these methods are best or emerging practice, but each piece of communication is unique. It's got its own purpose, its own context, its own constraints. So best practice will only get you so far. And really the only reliable way to get people to check that people have or haven't understood your content and to guide you in the right direction of improving comprehension is through user testing and iteration, which kind of brings us back full circle to our approach for testing comprehension that I mentioned at the start. Okay, that's everything. Thanks so much for joining and sticking with me through that and listening today.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for today's session, Stu. That was brilliant. I loved all the quizzes throughout too. I thought they were just great. So I think we'll go to questions now. I can see some have popped up in the Slido already, so thank you to those of you who've already shared. If you haven't added yours yet, you can do so via the Slido button at the bottom right of your screen, and we'd love to hear from as many as you as possible, and we'll try and get through all the questions. So the first question we've had, Stu, from Kim is, how can you use the segmentation strategy for non-digital comms, such as letters?
Yeah, I mean, a really basic way is just to kind of separate content into groups of paragraphs with subheadings. Effectively, that's the same kind of thing. I was going to show an example of breaking up a recipe where you have like 20 steps, and if you then break up the recipe into 4 main segments, it makes it easier to kind of recall and navigate. Also, the pension statement I mentioned earlier, just visually kind of boxing things off visually in some way can help segment it in that way as well. Yeah, those are
Thank
two
you.
good ways.
We've had another question that's asked, can you do all of this in isolation, or does it need to be something that happens company-wide?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. I think it's probably a case of, I don't typically when we take clients on a journey, we try and work on something quite small and show the value of it in, maybe one piece of communication. But then it does obviously help to embed it within the organization somehow through some kind of tone of voice guidelines or style guides or that kind of thing. And I showed some examples from the BBC earlier, and they're really good at doing this. They have all the training videos, like the Alan Little quote that I showed you, but they also have style guides, and they have in their UX and D guidelines, they talk about short paragraphs. So I think, test it, get evidence, and then try and codify it in some way.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. Then we have a question from Faye. Do you think financial institutions should also play a role in education and enhance users' financial literacy? If so, how should they balance this with comprehension?
Yeah, I think I do. I think it's kind of there's a book by Mark Carney called Values, and he talks about effective transparency, and a lot of what they're doing in the Bank of England is, I mean, this was some time ago that he was working at the Bank of England. Obviously, he's now Prime Minister of Canada, but he tried to introduce this idea that the Bank of England should be educating the population more broadly to understand how the economy works and that kind of thing. And they've written books since, and the idea is that you then empower people to take control of their kind of finances and to understand what's heard about in the news. And it feels like financial institutions are a big part of that, and the responsibility kind of lies with them as well. And I think it's a benefit to them as well if customers understand more about how these systems work. They can kind of navigate them better, and yeah. I can't promise it would lead to great commercial gains, but it feels like there would be definitely a benefit there.
Yeah. Um, and then we have one more question in the Slido, but if anyone does have any others, feel free to pop them in now. We still have about 10 minutes where we can run through any more. So the last question we have at the moment is, how would you recommend to introduce friction?
So yeah, we talked about some ways just there. One was kind of clicking through things, like making people pause and click through. One of the things that I was doing in the presentation was using quizzes, and you see that often in apps like Duolingo and the Imprint app that I showed. And actually, Robinhood, now, if you go through those guides, sometimes they ask you a series of questions. And it's interesting that quiz pattern is quite interesting. In the last webinar, I was looking at how you test for comprehension. And if you have those quizzes through the experience, it can give you two benefits. One is that it helps people kind of understand the information, but the other benefit is that you can kind of then start to measure comprehension as well. And that's my colleague Tom Scott, that was kind of his thinking, but it's a great idea. The other ways you can add friction is through some kind of interaction as well. So making people kind of click and interact with calculators and that kind of thing. There's a theory called embodied cognition. And I think there's a study around where if you trace angles, children were taught about geometry, and if they trace the angles with their finger, they're more likely to kind of retain the information. I have to dig out the study, but yeah, there's lots of other ways that you can do it as well.
Oh, great. Thank you. We've actually just had another question through from Hazel, who's asked, please could you give a brief overview of the new FCA Consumer Duty relevant to this context?
Gosh, I'd struggle to do that, to be honest.
Yeah, it's
My
quite
colleague
a
Stu
big
Charlton,
question.
who I did the last webinar with, is the expert in this. But I mean, the crux of it is that it's on the bank, or that it's on the financial institution to make sure um, their materials are understandable for consumers, and it encourages them to test content with consumers to make sure that's that's the case. So you can't just kind of put comms out there and assume that everyone is going to make sense of it, and you can't kind of deliberately mislead them. I think the phrase is clear, fair, and never misleading.
And I know we've had,
We can maybe share some resources where we can
yeah.
talk more about that.
Yeah, we've done a couple of webinars previously, I think, where we've kind of touched on that in a bit more detail, so I can send those over to you as well, Hazel. So I think that's all the questions we've had. Let me just double check I've not missed any. So I think we'll wrap up there. I'll just actually pop this link, the first webinar in the Slido. So that's in there in case anyone wants to sort of go and catch up on that one. But yeah, thank you for everyone coming along today and for all of your questions. And thank you again to Stu for the brilliant talk. It really was so insightful. So thank you for your time.
Can I just say one other thing? Sorry, Lauren.
Yeah, go for it.
I guess all the people today will probably have other similar tips from what improves comprehension and in their experience. And so I'm genuinely kind of really interested in this stuff. So if you've got examples of things that work, then please kind of send them to us. I'd be really interested to see.
Yeah, definitely. It would be great to see those. And yeah, so if we can sort of share all of those around, that would be lovely. And we'll also be sharing this recording with you all very soon. So feel free to share that with your teams too. We'd also love to hear your feedback on today's session. So let us know what you found most useful as well. But yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much, guys. See you later. Have a great day.